Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where millions of tourists snap photos daily, a different kind of drama unfolds. This isn't the fairy tale the world sees on magazine covers or royal wedding broadcasts. This is the raw, unfiltered truth about what happens when ancient traditions clash with modern expectations, when family loyalty meets political pressure, and when two people must choose between their own happiness and the weight of a 1,000-year-old crown. The story you're about to read isn't just about William and Kate. It's about every person who has ever felt trapped between duty and desire, every couple who has faced impossible odds, and every individual who discovered that true strength doesn't come from titles or wealth, but from the courage to stand up for what's right, even when the entire establishment stands against you. What happens when a most watched couple in the world faces their greatest test? When palace walls become prison walls, and when the very people sworn to protect them become the greatest threat to their future. This is that story, raw, authentic, and more dramatic than any soap opera because it's built on the foundation of real human emotion, real consequences, and real people fighting for real love in an unreal world. The morning fog clung to the windows of Kensington Palace like a warning, obscuring the view of the carefully manicured gardens that had witnessed centuries of royal secrets. Inside, Catherine sat at her dressing table, her reflection showing none of the confidence the world expected from the future Queen of England. Her hands trembled slightly as she applied her lipstick, the same shade she'd worn to 100 public engagements. But today felt different. Today, everything would change. William paced behind her, his usually composed demeanor cracking like ice under pressure. The conversation they'd had the night before still echoed in the room, heavy with implications that neither of them fully understood yet. The palace staff moved around them with practiced efficiency, but Catherine caught the worried glances exchanged between her lady-in-waiting and the protection officer stationed near the door. Even they could sense the tension that had been building for weeks. The call had come at dawn from Buckingham Palace, not through the usual channels, not with the formal protocols that governed every aspect of their lives. This was different, personal, urgent, the kind of call that made Catherine's stomach drop before she even answered it. The voice on the other end belonged to Sir Edward Worthington, the Queen's private secretary, a man whose words carried the weight of the monarchy itself. His message was simple but chilling. Their Majesty's request an immediate private audience. Come alone. But William had refused to let her face whatever storm was brewing by herself. They were in this together. He'd insisted, just as they promised each other on their wedding day. The for better or worse part of their vows had never felt more relevant than it did in this moment. Walking through the corridors of Buckingham Palace toward an uncertain fate. The palace corridors seemed longer than usual that morning, each step echoing off the marble floors like a countdown. The portraits of previous monarchs watched from their gilded frames, their painted eyes following the couple as they made their way toward the Queen's private study. Catherine found herself wondering what secrets these walls had witnessed, what other couples had walked this same path toward judgment. The guards they passed were different too, not the usual friendly faces who had grown accustomed to William and Catherine's presence over the years. These were strangers, stern-faced men who avoided eye contact and kept their hands positioned near their weapons. The change in security protocol was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood palace operations. Someone had given orders to treat them as potential threats rather than family members. When they reached the oak doors of the Queen's study, they found themselves facing not just Her Majesty, but a tribunal of the most powerful figures in the royal establishment. The Queen sat behind her mahogany desk, her expression unreadable, but her posture rigid with authority. To her right stood the Archbishop of Canterbury, his religious robes a stark reminder of the sacred oaths that bound the royal family. To her left, the Prime Minister's representative, a sharp-eyed woman whose presence indicated this was more than a family matter. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Catherine felt William's hand brush against hers, a small gesture of solidarity that gave her the strength to lift her chin and meet the Queen's gaze directly. This was the woman who had welcomed her into the family, who had guided her through the complexities of royal protocol, who had seemed genuinely fond of her. But the woman sitting across from them now wore the crown of centuries, not the gentle expression of a grandmother. Sir Edward cleared his throat, the sound sharp in the hushed room. He held a manila folder in his hands, thick with documents that seemed to contain their fate. "Your Royal Highnesses," he began, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth, "we have gathered evidence of activities that are incompatible with your royal duties and obligations." The words hit Catherine like physical blows. Activities? What activities? Her mind raced through every public appearance, every private moment, every decision she and William had made in recent months. What could they possibly have done that warranted this formal interrogation? William stepped forward, his protective instincts overriding royal protocol. "I demand to know what these allegations are," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his birthright, but also the desperation of a husband defending his wife. "Catherine has served this family and this country with absolute dedication." The Archbishop spoke next, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Your Royal Highness, it is not dedication we question, but discretion. There are matters of faith, of tradition, of the very foundation upon which this monarchy rests." He opened a leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. "The oaths you both took, the promises made not just to each other, but to the British people, to the Commonwealth, to God himself." Catherine's heart pounded as the implications became clear. Someone had been watching them, documenting their private conversations, their moments of doubt, their human struggles with the impossible expectations placed upon them. The goldfish bowl existence they had accepted as the price of their position had become something more sinister, more invasive than they had ever imagined. The Queen finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of 70 years on the throne. "Catherine," she said, using her given name rather than her title, a subtle but devastating demotion. "When you married William, you became more than a wife. You became a symbol, a guardian of traditions that stretch back 1,000 years. Recent intelligence suggests you have forgotten this responsibility." The folder opened, revealing photographs, transcripts, reports that painted a picture of two people struggling with their roles, questioning the system they were meant to represent. Private conversations between William and Catherine about the relevance of the monarchy in the modern world. Moments of frustration captured by hidden microphones. Questions about whether their children should have the choice to walk away from royal duty. But there was something else in those documents, something that made Catherine's blood run cold. Financial records showing donations to causes the establishment deemed inappropriate. Communications with journalists who had been critical of royal spending. Evidence of what could be construed as disloyalty, even treason. The trap had been perfectly laid. Every human moment, every private doubt, every attempt to modernize or question outdated protocols had been twisted into evidence of their unworthiness to serve. The very qualities that made them relatable to the British people, their humanity and authenticity, were being used as weapons against them. William's face had gone pale as he recognized the sophistication of the operation arrayed against them. This wasn't a spontaneous reaction to recent events. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign that had been building for months, maybe years. Someone with access to the highest levels of palace security had been collecting ammunition for this moment. The realization hit them both simultaneously. They weren't just facing questions about their loyalty or competence. They were facing a coup, a palace revolution designed to remove them from the line of succession and install more compliant alternatives. The forces of tradition and conservatism within the royal establishment had decided that William and Catherine's modernizing influence was a threat that needed to be eliminated. But as Catherine looked at her husband, she saw something that gave her hope. William's initial shock was transforming into something harder, more determined. The man who had once told her that his family's motto was never complain, never explain, was preparing to do both. The dutiful prince was disappearing, replaced by a husband and father who would fight for his family's future. The battle lines were drawn. On one side stood the weight of tradition, the power of the establishment, the seemingly unshakable force of royal protocol. On the other stood two people who had dared to love authentically, to question respectfully, and to imagine a monarchy that served the people rather than simply ruling them. The Queen's next words would determine whether this confrontation remained a private family matter or exploded into the greatest constitutional crisis the British monarchy had faced in generations. Catherine squeezed William's hand, drawing strength from their connection as they prepared to face whatever came next. The morning fog outside had lifted, but inside the palace, the real storm was just beginning to gather force. The next few hours would determine not just their personal fate, but the future direction of an institution that had survived wars, scandals, and centuries of change. The question was whether it could survive the challenge of two people who refused to be anything less than authentic. As the silence stretched toward breaking point, Catherine realized that this moment would define not just their reign, but their character. They could surrender to the pressure, accept the constraints, and live as beautiful prisoners in golden cages, where they could stand tall, face the consequences, and fight for the right to serve their country as themselves, flaws and all. The choice was theirs, but the outcome would belong to history. The silence shattered when William spoke, his voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "Your Majesty, with all due respect, if loving my wife and wanting to serve our country honestly is considered treason, then perhaps it's time to examine what this institution has become." The words hung in the air like a challenge thrown down at the feet of centuries of tradition. The Prime Minister's representative shifted uncomfortably, clearly calculating the political implications of a royal family civil war. The Archbishop's face darkened with disapproval, while Sir Edward looked as though he had witnessed something close to blasphemy. But it was the Queen's reaction that mattered most. For a long moment, she studied her grandson with an expression that was impossible to read. Was it disappointment? Admiration? Perhaps a mixture of both? Catherine held her breath, knowing that the next few seconds would determine the trajectory of their entire future. "Sit down," the Queen said finally, her voice softer than it had been moments before. It wasn't a request. It was a command that somehow felt like an invitation to something more honest than what had come before. William and Catherine exchanged glances before taking the chairs positioned across from the formidable assembly. What followed was unlike any conversation either of them had experienced within these palace walls. The Queen set aside the formal protocol that usually governed their interactions and began to speak not as a monarch, but as a grandmother who had watched her family struggle with the impossible weight of public expectation for decades. She told them about her own early years on the throne, the mistakes she had made, the advisors who had tried to control her every move. She spoke about the loneliness of leadership, the crushing responsibility of being a symbol rather than simply a person. Most importantly, she revealed something that neither William nor Catherine had ever suspected. She had been fighting her own battle against the very forces that were now arrayed against them. The documents spread across the desk represented more than just surveillance of William and Catherine. They were evidence of a power struggle that had been brewing within the palace walls for years. Conservative elements within the royal household, supported by political figures who benefited from maintaining the status quo, had been systematically undermining any attempts at modernization or reform. Sir Edward's folder contained not just evidence against William and Catherine, but proof of a broader conspiracy to maintain the monarchy as a museum piece rather than a living, evolving institution. The same network that had documented their private conversations had also been working to sabotage their public initiatives, leaked unfavorable stories to the press, and actively opposed their efforts to make the royal family more accessible and relevant to ordinary citizens. The realization hit Catherine like a physical blow. The difficult press coverage they had endured, the inexplicable resistance to their charitable initiatives, the constant feeling that they were fighting against invisible opponents. It all made sense now. They hadn't been paranoid. They had been under attack by people who were supposed to be their allies. But the Queen's revelation contained an even more shocking truth. She had been aware of this conspiracy for months, had been gathering her own evidence, building her own case against the forces that sought to undermine the future of the monarchy. The morning's confrontation hadn't been an interrogation. It had been a test. "You see," the Queen explained, her eyes moving between William and Catherine with something that looked remarkably like pride. "I needed to know whether you would surrender at the first sign of serious opposition, or whether you possess the strength to fight for what you believe in." The Archbishop and the Prime Minister's representative looked increasingly uncomfortable as the Queen's true purpose became clear. They had been invited to witness what they thought would be a humiliation, but instead found themselves observing a masterpiece of strategic maneuvering that had been years in the making. William leaned forward, his mind racing to process the implications of what he was hearing. "You're telling us that this entire morning has been orchestrated? That you've been testing us?" "Not testing," the Queen corrected gently. "Preparing you. The forces you've encountered today are real, and they will not simply disappear because we've exposed them in this room. If you're to succeed in modernizing this institution, you need to understand exactly what you're fighting against." Catherine found her voice for the first time since entering the room. "What do you need from us?" The question surprised her with its boldness, but she realized that boldness was exactly what this moment required. The Queen smiled, the first genuine warmth she had shown all morning. "I need you to be exactly who you are. The monarchy doesn't need more people who blindly follow protocol and never question whether our traditions serve the people we're meant to represent. It needs leaders who understand that tradition and progress are not enemies, but partners in building something better." Over the next 2 hours, the conversation transformed from confrontation to collaboration. The Queen outlined a plan that was breathtaking in its scope and ambition. William and Catherine weren't just being asked to weather this storm. They were being invited to lead a revolution from within, to reshape the monarchy for the 21st century while honoring the best of its traditions. The evidence in Sir Edward's folder would be used not to destroy William and Catherine, but to expose the network of resistance that had been undermining the royal family's ability to evolve and adapt. The conservative elements that had sought to use this information as blackmail would find themselves outmaneuvered by a strategy they had never anticipated. But the plan came with risks that made Catherine's head spin. They would be declaring war on some of the most powerful figures in British society, people who had spent their careers manipulating public opinion and political outcomes. The personal cost could be devastating, and there was no guarantee that they would emerge victorious. The Queen was offering them a choice that was both liberating and terrifying. They could return to their previous lives, accept the constraints and limitations that had been slowly suffocating their ability to serve effectively. Or they could step forward into an uncertain future where they would have the freedom to be authentic leaders, but would face opposition unlike anything they had previously encountered. William looked at Catherine, seeking some sign of her thoughts in her expression. What he saw, there was the same mixture of fear and determination that he felt in his own heart. They had not asked for this fight, but they had been preparing for it their entire married life, even without realizing it. The Archbishop spoke for the first time in over an hour, his voice heavy with concern. "Your Majesty, the risks of such a course of action are enormous. The stability of the institution, the relationship with Parliament, the faith of the people, all of this could be jeopardized by moving too quickly toward change. And all of it will certainly be destroyed by moving too slowly," the Queen replied firmly. "The monarchy will not survive by hiding from the modern world. It will only survive by embracing the best of modernity while holding fast to the values that have made us who we are." The Prime Minister's representative finally spoke, her political instincts clearly struggling with the implications of what she was witnessing. The government would need assurances that any changes would be implemented gradually, with full consultation and democratic oversight. Catherine surprised herself by responding before either William or the Queen could speak. Democracy doesn't mean that change only happens when it's convenient for politicians. Sometimes it means that institutions have the courage to evolve because it's the right thing to do, not because it's the politically expedient thing to do. The room fell silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It was the pause before a leap, the moment when everyone present realized that they were witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in the long history of the British monarchy. William reached for Catherine's hand, their fingers intertwining as they had countless times before, but this time the gesture felt like a promise. They were choosing to step forward together into whatever storm awaited them, united not just by love, but by a shared vision of what their service could become. The Queen stood, signaling that the formal portion of the meeting was ending, but Catherine sensed that the real work was just beginning. As they prepared to leave the room, she realized that they were no longer the same people who had entered it a few hours before. They had been transformed from reluctant participants in an ancient system to architects of its future. The battle ahead would test everything they thought they knew about loyalty, duty, and the true meaning of service. But for the first time since their wedding day, Catherine felt genuinely hopeful about what their future might hold. They were no longer fighting against the system. They were fighting to save it. The weeks following the confrontation at Buckingham Palace transformed into a chess game played on a board that stretched across the entire British establishment. William and Catherine found themselves living in a world where every conversation could be monitored, every public appearance analyzed for signs of the revolution brewing beneath the surface, and every ally carefully evaluated for their true loyalties. The first move came from an unexpected source. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, the head of their personal protection detail, requested a private meeting that would change everything they thought they knew about palace security. Collins had served the royal family for 15 years, earning a reputation for unshakable discretion and absolute loyalty. But the woman who sat across from them in the secure meeting room at Kensington Palace looked haunted by secrets she could no longer keep. "Your Royal Highnesses," Collins began, her voice tight with controlled emotion, "I have a duty to protect you from all threats, whether they come from outside these walls or from within them. What I'm about to tell you violates every protocol I've sworn to uphold, but I believe it's the only way to keep you safe." She spread a series of photographs across the table, images that made Catherine's blood run cold. Pictures of their children playing in supposedly private moments, taken with telephoto lenses from impossible angles. Audio transcripts of conversations between William and Catherine in rooms that were supposed to be completely secure. Financial records showing payments to palace staff members who had been feeding information to unknown recipients. The surveillance network that had been tracking their activities was far more extensive than even the Queen had realized. It reached into every aspect of their daily lives, from the staff who prepared their meals to the drivers who transported them to public engagements. Most disturbing of all, it included people they had considered friends, colleagues who had shared intimate moments of their lives while secretly documenting every detail. Collins explained how she had discovered the conspiracy through her own security protocols. Routine sweeps for electronic surveillance had revealed sophisticated listening devices that shouldn't have existed, planted by people with intimate knowledge of palace operations. When she began investigating the source, she uncovered a network that extended far beyond the royal household into the highest levels of government and media. "The people behind this aren't just trying to control your public image," Collins warned them. "They're building a case for your complete removal from the line of succession. The evidence they're gathering isn't meant for private pressure. It's meant for public humiliation on a scale that would destroy not just your reputations, but the monarchy itself." William felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. "What kind of evidence?" Collins hesitated before answering, clearly struggling with the implications of what she had to reveal. "They have recordings of private conversations where you've discussed the possibility of stepping away from royal duties. They have financial records that could be interpreted as misuse of public funds. Most damaging of all, they have communications that could be twisted to suggest disloyalty to the Commonwealth." Catherine realized that every moment of doubt, every private conversation about the challenges of royal life, every human expression of frustration with the constraints of their position had been weaponized against them. The conspiracy wasn't just collecting evidence of wrongdoing. It was manufacturing evidence by taking their most vulnerable moments and presenting them in the worst possible light. But Collins had more to reveal. The network had also been manipulating their public schedule, ensuring they were placed in situations that would generate unfavorable coverage. The charitable initiatives that had faced unexpected resistance, the public appearances that had gone wrong despite careful planning, the media coverage that seemed inexplicably hostile, all of it had been orchestrated by people who were supposed to be supporting their work. How do we fight something like this? Catherine asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of the betrayal they were facing. You don't fight it, Collins replied. You expose it. But that means taking risks that go far beyond anything you've faced before. The protection officer outlined a plan that was as brilliant as it was dangerous. Instead of trying to defend against the surveillance network, they would use it against itself. By carefully controlling what information reached the conspirators, they could set traps that would expose the true scope of the operation and identify all of its key players. The plan required William and Catherine to become actors in their own lives, crafting conversations and activities designed to flush out the sources of the leaks. They would have to live with the knowledge that their most intimate moments were being monitored while using that surveillance to gather evidence that could destroy the people behind it. Over the following days, they began implementing Collins' strategy with a precision that surprised them both. They planted false information in conversations with specific staff members, then tracked which details appeared in unauthorized reports. They scheduled fake private meetings to identify which security breaches were being exploited. Most importantly, they began documenting everything, building their own evidence file that would prove the existence of the conspiracy. The psychological toll was enormous. Every conversation became a performance. Every gesture calculated for its potential impact on unseen observers. They found themselves questioning the loyalty of people who had been part of their lives for years, analyzing every interaction for signs of deception or betrayal. But the strategy began to yield results that exceeded their expectations. The conspiracy they uncovered reached into the highest levels of the British establishment, including members of Parliament, senior civil servants, and influential media figures. The goal wasn't just to control William and Catherine, but to use them as weapons in a broader political battle over the future direction of British society. The evidence they gathered revealed a network that viewed the monarchy not as a constitutional institution serving the British people, but as a tool for maintaining their own power and influence. William and Catherine's efforts to modernize the royal family's approach to public service threatened relationships and financial arrangements that had been decades in the making. The most shocking revelation came when they traced the funding for the surveillance operation. The money was coming from a combination of sources that painted a picture of corruption that reached to the very heart of the British government. Foreign interests seeking to influence British policy, domestic corporations hoping to maintain profitable relationships with the royal household, and political figures who had built their careers on managing the monarchy's public image. Collins presented them with a choice that would determine not just their own future, but the future of the entire constitutional system. They had gathered enough evidence to destroy the conspiracy, but using it would trigger a crisis that could bring down the government and potentially destabilize the monarchy itself. The question isn't whether you have the power to expose this, Collins explained. The question is whether you're willing to accept the consequences of using that power. William and Catherine found themselves facing the same choice that had confronted their ancestors for centuries: personal safety versus public duty. They could use the evidence they had gathered to protect themselves while allowing the broader corruption to continue, or they could risk everything to expose a system that threatened the integrity of British democracy itself. The decision they made would echo through history, but it would also determine whether their children would inherit a monarchy worth preserving or a hollow shell maintained only for the benefit of those who profited from its continued existence. As they sat in their private study that evening, looking at the evidence spread across their table like pieces of a puzzle that revealed a picture more disturbing than they had ever imagined, Catherine reached for William's hand. The gesture had become their anchor throughout this ordeal, a reminder that whatever they faced together. "We didn't ask for this fight," she said quietly. "No," William replied, his voice heavy with the weight of decision. "But we're the only ones who can finish it." The next morning would bring choices that would define not just their reign, but their legacy. The conspiracy that had sought to use them as pawns in a larger game was about to discover that they had underestimated their targets. William and Catherine were no longer the naive young couple who had entered this world hoping to serve quietly and avoid controversy. They had become something far more dangerous to those who preferred the shadows. Leaders who understood the true cost of power and were willing to pay it in service of something larger than themselves. The morning of reckoning arrived with unexpected silence. No dramatic confrontations, no urgent phone calls, no visible signs of the earthquake that was about to shake the foundations of British society. William and Catherine sat at their breakfast table, the evidence files secured in a safe behind them, while their children played in the garden beyond the windows, blissfully unaware that their parents were about to change the course of history. Detective Inspector Collins had spent the night coordinating with a network of allies that had emerged from the shadows as the conspiracy unraveled. Journalists whose integrity had been questioned when they refused to publish manufactured stories. Civil servants who had been marginalized for asking uncomfortable questions, and even members of Parliament who had found themselves excluded from inner circles for displaying inconvenient principles. The plan they had developed was breathtaking in its scope and precision. Instead of simply exposing the conspiracy through traditional media channels that could be controlled or discredited, they would present the evidence simultaneously to multiple oversight bodies, international organizations, and independent journalists across the globe. The story would break everywhere at once, making it impossible for the usual damage control mechanisms to contain the revelations. But the most crucial element of their strategy involved the Queen herself. Her Majesty had been working behind the scenes to prepare the constitutional framework for what was about to unfold, consulting with legal scholars and Commonwealth leaders to ensure that the monarchy would not just survive the coming crisis, but emerge stronger and more legitimate than before. At precisely 9 o'clock that morning, the first documents began arriving at news organizations across 3 continents. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously documented. Recordings of conspiracy meetings, financial records showing illegal payments, communications proving coordination between supposedly independent institutions, and photographs that captured the surveillance network in action. The story exploded across international headlines with a force that surprised even those who had orchestrated its release. The conspiracy to control and ultimately remove William and Catherine from the line of succession was revealed in all its complexity, but more importantly, it exposed a system of corruption that had been operating at the highest levels of British society for decades. The immediate reaction was chaos. Parliament was forced into emergency session as members scrambled to distance themselves from colleagues who had been implicated in the scandal. Media organizations found themselves investigating their own newsrooms as the extent of the manipulation became clear. Corporate executives who had participated in the conspiracy faced criminal investigations that would destroy their careers and potentially result in prison sentences. But it was the public reaction that proved most decisive. The British people, who had grown increasingly skeptical of their institutions over recent years, responded to the revelations with a mixture of outrage and hope that surprised political observers. Rather than viewing the scandal as reason to abandon the monarchy, they saw William and Catherine's courage in exposing it as proof that the royal family could be trusted to serve the people rather than the establishment. The conspiracy's attempt to portray William and Catherine as disloyal to British traditions had backfired spectacularly. By revealing the surveillance network and the attempts to manipulate their public image, the couple had demonstrated a form of loyalty that transcended blind obedience to corrupt systems. They had chosen to serve the British people even when it meant defying the very institutions they were supposed to represent. The international response was equally significant. Commonwealth leaders who had been privately concerned about the monarchy's ability to adapt to modern expectations found themselves dealing with a royal couple who had proven their commitment to transparency and accountability in the most dramatic way possible. The scandal that was supposed to weaken the monarchy's global standing instead strengthened it by demonstrating that the institution could reform itself from within. The weeks that followed brought changes that transformed not just the royal household, but the entire structure of British governance. The investigations triggered by the evidence William and Catherine had gathered led to resignations, prosecutions, and institutional reforms that had been considered impossible just months before. Sir Edward Worthington was among the first casualties, his resignation coming within hours of the initial revelations. The archbishop who had participated in the attempted intimidation found himself facing questions from his own hierarchy about his role in the conspiracy. The prime minister's representative who had witnessed the palace confrontation discovered that her political career was effectively over as her connections to the scandal became public knowledge. But the most significant changes came within the royal household itself. The Queen announced a comprehensive review of palace security protocols, financial procedures, and staff vetting processes. More importantly, she established new mechanisms for transparency and accountability that would make it impossible for future conspiracies to operate with the same impunity. William and Catherine found themselves at the center of a transformation they had never anticipated. The couple who had entered the crisis as potential victims emerged as leaders of a movement that was reshaping the relationship between the monarchy and the British people. Their willingness to risk everything for the sake of truth had earned them a level of public trust and respect that no amount of traditional royal pageantry could have achieved. The personal cost had been enormous. Friendships had been destroyed, trusted advisors had revealed themselves as enemies, and the comfortable certainties of their previous life had been replaced by the complex responsibilities of leadership during a time of fundamental change. But they had also discovered strengths they didn't know they possessed, and a partnership that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger than ever. 6 months after the morning that had started with an intimidating summons to Buckingham Palace, William and Catherine stood before a gathering of Commonwealth leaders who had come to London for an emergency conference on constitutional reform. The meeting that was supposed to address the crisis created by the scandal had instead become a celebration of the monarchy's successful evolution. The speech William delivered that day would be studied by historians for generations to come. He spoke about the difference between loyalty to institutions and loyalty to the values those institutions were meant to represent. He acknowledged the mistakes that had been made and the reforms that were still needed. Most importantly, he articulated a vision for the monarchy that embraced both tradition and progress, both stability and change. Catherine's contribution was equally significant, but more personal. She spoke about the human cost of living under surveillance, the challenge of maintaining authenticity in a world that demanded perfection, and the responsibility of public figures to serve as examples of integrity rather than simply symbols of status. Her words resonated not just with the official delegates, but with millions of people around the world who were watching the proceedings. The reforms that emerged from the conference transformed the constitutional framework that had governed the British monarchy for centuries. New provisions for transparency, accountability, and democratic oversight were established. The royal family's finances were subjected to unprecedented scrutiny and public reporting. Most importantly, the tradition of unquestioning deference to royal authority was replaced by a system that expected the monarchy to earn its legitimacy through service rather than simply inherit it through bloodline. The conspiracy that had sought to destroy William and Catherine had inadvertently created the conditions for the most significant royal reform in modern history. Their enemies had succeeded in forcing a crisis, but the resolution of that crisis had strengthened rather than weakened the institution they had hoped to control. Detective Inspector Collins received a commendation that recognized her courage in exposing the surveillance network, though the full extent of her role would remain classified for decades to come. The protection officers who had remained loyal to their oaths rather than their paychecks found themselves leading a transformed security service that prioritized the safety of constitutional democracy alongside the physical protection of the royal family. As William and Catherine returned to Kensington Palace after the Commonwealth Conference, they found themselves looking forward to a future that was uncertain but full of possibility. The children who greeted them in the garden would inherit a monarchy that had proven its ability to adapt reform, and serve the needs of the people rather than the interests of the powerful. The battle they had fought, and one was already passing into legend, but its consequences would shape the British constitutional system for generations to come. They had entered the crisis as young royals trying to find their place in an ancient institution. They emerged as leaders who had helped that institution discover its place in the modern world. The palace power struggles that had threatened to destroy them had instead revealed the true source of their strength, an unwavering commitment to serve something larger than themselves, even when that service required them to challenge the very system they had been born to represent. In the end, their greatest act of loyalty had been their willingness to ensure that loyalty meant more than blind obedience. The story that had begun with surveillance and suspicion had ended with transparency and hope. The monarchy that emerged from the crisis was not the same institution that had entered it, but it was recognizably the same in its essential commitment to serving the British people and the Commonwealth. William and Catherine had not just survived their ordeal. They had transformed it into the foundation for a reign that would be remembered not for its adherence to tradition, but for its courage in creating new traditions worthy of the values it claimed to represent.